Welcome everyone. This is the very first session of our introduction to eViews, and curiously we're actually not going to be using eViews in the very first session. What I'm going to do in the first session is encourage you basically that before you even start eViews to basically get into the habit of checking your data and having a look at some of the salient features of that data as a way of sort of getting a feel for the type of regression model that you might want to use and to understand some of the issues in the actual data set itself. So let's begin our learning sequence here, or our introduction, by basically opening up the Excel spreadsheet that contains the data that we will be working with in this, throughout this module. And I'm showing it to you in front of you here. I've already got it opened and it's in Excel, and what you're looking at is a seemingly random set of numbers basically in this sheet called matrix. The naming is rather deliberate, but basically the idea here is to show you that it's organized. It seems like there's some behavior in there, but it's not labeled at all. So that's what we call basically just a matrix. There's obviously rows and there's columns, and some of these rows begin in some of these columns begin in different points on the row axis. There are some missing values here and there. Okay, what you should be looking at is the matrix worksheet, and obviously it looks like a seemingly random set of numbers, but clearly it's a matrix. There are rows and there are columns, and they're not labeled yet, so we're not quite sure what each of these values mean, but I assure you that actually that they're all a set of economic numbers. But notice that some of the series, some of these columns actually start at different points in time, and some of the columns have missing values at this point here, for example, and here. So this is a kind of classic matrix that you might be dealing with when you're doing forecasting, having data organized in columns, some of it beginning earlier than others, as I'll explain, and you'll have missing values. All right, so let's try and make some sense of this by clicking on the Fiji tab, or the Fiji worksheet, and now you see a slightly different view of exactly the same data, but now what I've done, which is important, is that firstly I've introduced an initial row here which adds labels to the columns to give you a sense of what each column represents. And working our way down here, we've basically added dates to each of the rows, which is telling you that every row in this sheet represents a year. Now, so that you know what each column here represents an economic concept. So, and in particular, the column B actually represents the real GDP of Fiji, expressed in billions of their own currency, Fijian dollars. Okay, the second column actually represents the growth rate in the real GDP series. The third column represents the real GDP of Australia. The idea being that because Australia is a major trading partner of Fiji, that essentially it buys a lot of the products that Fiji produces, including offering much tourism services to Australia, that if Australia grows, Fiji tends to grow along with it. The column E represents the growth rate of Australia in real terms, expressed in percentage point terms. F represents, the column F is actually the real exchange rate of Fiji, and as it goes down, that's essentially a relative depreciation of the effective exchange rate of Fiji. G happens to be something very specific to Fiji, or the Republic of Fiji. It was a very large producer of sugar output, and sugar output had played a dominant role in its economy, especially in the earlier years. And so this represents sugar output production, captures sugar output production. The idea is that that helps to contribute, that contributes clearly to GDP, and the growth rate in sugar output is also mentioned in the column H. And finally, in the ith column, in column I here, I've basically got the same series as sugar output of Fiji, but I've deliberately introduced missing values here in the series. In other words, I've knocked out 1998 and 2005 because later on, particularly in session 7, we'll show you some operators within the eViews that allows you to remove those missing values fairly easily. Now, in this view, basically what you have, of course, is labels in the first row and dates in the first column. And what you're seeing is the holistic view of the data that ultimately you'll probably use to run a regression. And I like to call this highlighted area basically a time series matrix. So it's a matrix of data with labels and dates that basically help you to organize it. Now, another way of looking at the same data is to actually transpose the time series matrix. And here, now I've actually got the names of the series in the first column and the actual dates along the right in the first row. Okay, so each row represents the data available for all the series. Now, as it turns out, you can actually organize your data either in both ways, either in column major or row major. eViews can easily basically import the data quite easily, and we'll demonstrate that later on. Now, what I'd like you to get into the habit of is basically trying to see some of the salient features of the data before you even bring it into any econometrics package. The first thing I want to point out to you is essentially the growth rate of real GDP in the case of Fiji. Now, the blue line here is actually real GDP of Fiji, and it's relative to the left-hand side axis. The red line actually represents the growth rate of this Fiji. Now, you can see here that there has been a steady upward swing basically in real GDP in the case of the Republic of Fiji, but certainly the growth rate hasn't been too smooth. I mean, it's been rather volatile. Certainly it's been largely positive, but there has been quite a few episodes where the growth rate has been negative. But there's certainly a lot of volatility in the growth rate of Fiji, suggesting that that they have been subject to significant amount of shocks in their upward growth path. Likewise, when it comes to sugar production, once again, well, what's interesting here is that in the case of Fiji, sugar production is on the downswing. You can see it started off at around 4 million tonnes per annum, and it's moved its way down to almost half that by 2014. And again, the growth rate is rather volatile with some significant spikes, as evident in the red time series. Now, let me just show you a revealing scatter plot, basically. Now, this scatter plot is kind of revealing because it's a scatter plot of real GDP of Fiji against the real GDP of Australia, XY plot, and it's clearly suggesting that there is some sort of relationship between the growth rate, well, the real GDP of Australia and the real real GDP of Fiji. Now, we've imposed this by simply doing a scatter plot. It may not be true. I mean, it might not be true. It's just you can get a scatter plot between any two given series, but there are good reasons for suspecting that there is some sort of relationship between the two series, given the close link that the two countries have in terms of tourism and export services. But what's evident here is that, at least in raw form, there seems to be some sort of exponential, not exponential, sorry, this seems to be some sort of smooth nonlinear relationship between the two, or exponential relationship between the two series, or the two countries, which actually, if we took logs, might become linear, which is suggesting basically the use of a linear regression to explain real GDP of Fiji in terms of the real GDP of Australia. So, what do we get from an examination of the data? Well, clearly, it seems as if, it's obvious that the Republic of Fiji has experienced significant growth since 1970. It's on an upward path. There have been bumps along the way, and the growth rate has been volatile, moving between positive and negative phases quite a number of times. And it seems also that sugar output is becoming less important to the Republic of Fiji. And what's also evident is that Australia appears to be playing a significant role in influencing the long-term path of the real GDP of the Republic of Fiji. Okay, so that's the base introduction to getting to know your data. So thank you for listening. In the next session, we'll start our adventure into eViews.